Russian state media say that ousted Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad has been granted asylum in Moscow after fleeing his country. His regime collapsed in a lightning rebel offensive that began less than 2 weeks ago. Assad's fall has been a cause for widespread celebration across the country and among the Syrian diaspora. After almost 25 years under his rule, Syrians are beginning to turn their attention toward what rebel leaders say is a new era for their homeland. For more, I'm joined now by DW reporter Gasia Ohanes, who has been following the situation in Syria for us. What are you hearing, Gasia, about the security situation in the country right now?
Right, Nicole, it's just 24 hours after what was the biggest day for Syrians in Syria and scattered across the world. And now the eyes are on the security situation. Thankfully, so far, we haven't really seen any massive security incidents that affect people. As in, like, no killings, no violence, but there have been a lot of lootings, for example, with shops, with supermarkets. So now the question is, who's going to come in and provide the security services that the state was providing before they left? The HTS has already been doing this, but they're stretched thin at the moment. Syria is massive, and there's a lot of demand in different parts. There's remote areas which have been particularly affected by this. But we're going to have to see how they deal with that.
Yeah, it's an extremely fluid situation at the moment, right? So is there any clear way to say who's in charge right now in Syria?
Well, everybody's kind of stepped in to help at the moment in areas where the HTS hasn't really established their presence, like along the Syrian coast. I've heard, for example, from my village that there's been other armed groups who've come in, offered their services. They've said, we're here to help. We don't require anything in return. We just want to help protect people's properties, protect people's homes. So it is in their best interest to kind of make sure nothing goes wrong in this time. People have waited for so long for this moment, and they want to make sure that everything goes smoothly.
Some of the most striking pictures of the past days were people being released from prisons, from Assad's notorious prisons. What are you hearing about who these people are and what their experience has been?
It's very emotional right now with the prisoners. We've seen a lot of these videos, and you can see in the faces of some of them the kind of trauma and the horrors that they've endured. There's already been videos of people also from Sidnaya prison, which is the most notable one. It has been dubbed the human slaughterhouse. There have been calls to excavate sites around it, fearing that there's mass graves. So it's a lot of brutality that is now seeing the light of the day, and there's hundreds of families now at this moment still at Sidnaya waiting to hear if their loved ones are among those released. There's reports that there's still people underground in tunnels where they cannot access, behind doors that are coded. So the white helmets, which have been rescue workers working with the opposition, they've been deployed there. They've sent special units. They're working with ex-military people who would know, where these doors are, where these entrances are. And still there's no news of, anybody being found. So they're still looking, and it's still a tense moment. Families have gathered. There's crowds around the prison, and they're just waiting to hear about the fate of their loved ones.
The rebels that ended up toppling the Assad regime, they're not all one group, right? And the situation in Syria is notoriously fragmented and complicated. Now that the common goal of getting Assad out of the way, out of the country, has been achieved, how big do you think the danger is of them turning on each other?
Right. They had a common enemy, and now he's no longer there to unite these groups. You're right about that. But a lot of these groups now have the same common goal of trying to rebuild Syria and make sure it's a functional country. That being said, there's still a lot of disagreements, especially between, the Turkey-backed rebels and the Kurdish rebels. So the Syrian Free Army, which is backed by Turkey, and the Syrian Democratic Forces, which have now been looking at other areas and saying, what about our Kurdish prisoners? What is their fate? And they want to know what happens there. So we'll see how these groups will be able to negotiate and come together. But right now, it seems that the focus is still on, finding a way to transition peacefully to together.
I don't want to let you go. We don't have much time, but I don't want to let you go without asking about the millions of people who were displaced as part of this civil war. Are many now going to return, you think?
It's incredible what I've heard from Syrians all over the world. I've been in contact, with my friends, with people I know, and no one has kind of said that they're not willing to. Everybody wants to go back, even if just to visit, because it's been years that they haven't seen family. It's been years that they haven't seen their hometowns, their cities. So everybody's kind of waiting to see when it stabilizes that they can go. There's already a lot of people returning from Lebanon, returning from neighboring countries especially, and many are also waiting to see if there's going to be funding available to rebuild the country. They want to go back and make sure they're working on it as well themselves.
And I know that you're also planning to visit. That was Gasia Ohanes. Thank you so much. Let's bring in Bente Scheller. She's the head of the Middle East and North Africa division at the Heinrich Böll Foundation here in Berlin. Bente, let's start with a question of justice. Now that Assad is out of power and out of the country, will he be held accountable?
Well, since he and his family obviously fled to Russia, I doubt that there will be any possibility to have him in front of a court. However, he's not the only one to be held accountable. It was a system, a governmental, systemic system that had secret services torturing people, arresting people, forcibly disappearing people. So I think justice will need to cover much more than just Assad himself. And I think also listening to Syrians, justice efforts should also entail efforts to hold every armed actor in Syria accountable that has been part of human rights violations, the rebel factions, the Kurds, IS. None of them has been in front of the Syrian court, and I think we hear a lot of voices that are asking for these processes to happen.
Why are these processes, this transitional justice, so important in building a future Syria?
Because of the long history of injustice. And I think that has created rifts between different groups of the population along religious, sectarian, ethnic lines. But it also created the impression of impunity that basically every actor that was on good terms with the regime or later on the respective power holders in the different regions could get away with pretty much everything. And I think we could see at the beginning of the Syrian revolution that the lack of justice for the massacres that happened in the 1980s under Hafiz al-Assad's rule were essential in driving the energy of the uprising. And the people were asking questions about their relatives of who they had not heard for 30 years that back then had disappeared in Syria's notorious jails. So I think if we want stability, we need justice.
The rebels that ended up toppling Assad are not the only players in Syria. Of course, you mentioned some of them earlier. How big do you consider the danger of the country's many armed factions turning on each other at this moment of fluidity?
There is a risk of this, obviously, because some of them also have fought against each other in the past. However, I think it is pretty encouraging that so far violence has remained rather limited. I hope, of course, it stays like this. And I think the very strategic way the rebels have been advancing and how they also arranged with the Kurds, with the Druze to meet up in Damascus, that has worked out pretty well. Here, I think it's particularly relevant that the Alawites community that is mostly located in the coastal areas has not really been touched. This is not where the rebels have advanced, and I don't think that they threatened to do so. It's relevant because many members of the Assad regime are of the Alawite minority, and here, of course, people are afraid of revenge. So I think to see that this is not at the focus of current efforts of the rebels or any other party, that is a hopeful sign.
The events of the past days evoke memories of other revolutions in the Middle East, Libya's and Yemen's, for example. How can Syria ensure its own ends differently?
Well, I think Syrians have been thinking about it so much. How can they really work on a different future? I think they really want to turn the page. They have been looking at the other places. And for example, for Iraq, I think they notice it is much more relevant to take things into their own affairs and not get dominated of other parties. I hope they also learned when it comes to institutions. So I think we really see a lot of efforts over the past years to ensure a better future.
That's Bente Scheller from the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.